picture this. A Christmas market. You know, it smells like gingerbread, glue wine, people are laughing, kids are running around, friends are catching up. It's a pretty standard Friday night, just after 7 p.m., Magdeburg, Germany. And suddenly a car just like plows right through everyone.
Yeah, it's horrific. Really shatters that holiday, cheer. 5 people dead.
Over 200 injured.
And a whole community left trying to make sense of this senseless act.
It's a tough one for sure. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today, using the reports from Tagesschau and Deutsche Welle to try to really figure out, like, not just what happened, but like why, like who was this person? What would drive someone to do something this awful?
Well, right off the bat, we know the perpetrator was a 50-year-old Talibé.
Okay.
Saudi-born psychiatrist, granted asylum in Germany back in 2016. He was working with addiction patients.
Yeah.
But interestingly, he was on leave at the time of the attack.
On leave. Huh. That's strange.
It is, yeah.
It's also, like, Tagesschau, they use the word perpetrator, not suspect. Is there, like, a legal reason for that? Did that tell us something, before a trial even happens?
Yeah, you're right to notice that. It's a subtle thing, but it's important. Tagesschau's choice of words probably means, considering how public this attack was and that they caught him right there, they probably feel pretty confident about, who did it, even before a trial.
Makes sense. So the reports also mentioned that he, like, specifically drove into an emergency access route and then, like, floored it for over 400 meters through the market, like, didn't stop, went right back to where he started.
Yeah.
That whole emergency access route thing, it makes me wonder, like, about security at these Christmas markets. Are there, like, any major flaws?
Oh, for sure. It raises some serious concerns. I mean, after what happened in Berlin back in 2016, Germany really stepped up security, concrete barriers, things like that.
Right.
But as this shows us, you can't make these places 100% secure. It's about finding a balance.
Right.
You want people to feel safe, but you also don't want to lose that, open, festive atmosphere these markets are all about.
Yeah, that's tough. It's a tough situation. Okay, so let's try to unpack Talib A a little bit.
Sure.
The reports, they kind of paint a confusing picture, honestly. Online, he was calling himself a vehement Islam critic, even, like, stood up for women trying to escape Saudi Arabia. But then later on, he's, like, telling people not to seek asylum in Germany.
Exactly. And that's where we get into this idea of the atypical perpetrator. Yeah. These are individuals who, they don't fit neatly into any one category. Their reasons for doing these things, they're often a mix of personal issues, a worldview that's been warped by different ideologies, and, probably a lot of time spent online consuming really extreme content. They're hard to predict, basically.
So how does Talib fit into that? What makes him so hard to, figure out?
Well, think about this. He actually expressed support for the AfD party.
The far-right one.
Yeah. Even talked about working with them on some project. And then on top of that, he had a history of making threats. Like back in 2013, he was convicted for threats against the Kammer. Plus, he made racist remarks about judges, even threatened suicide. All this was before he got asylum in Germany.
It's mind-boggling. Like, how does someone with that kind of record end up getting asylum? Were there any warning signs, or was it just totally missed?
Actually, there were warnings about him. Both Saudi authorities and a private citizen flagged him as a concern to Germany.
Wait, hold on. Saudi Arabia warned Germany about him. What about this private citizen? What did they do?
The Saudi authorities, they actually asked for him to be extradited last year. And a private citizen sent a warning to the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees.
So, like, pretty serious warnings then? What happened? Did they just, like, not take them seriously?
Not necessarily. You have to remember, not every warning is created equal. The context really matters. Like, what exactly were they worried about? What evidence did they have? And then how did those warnings get passed around, within the different agencies? These are all things investigators are looking into now.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Those warnings are definitely a big part of this whole thing. So, leading up to the attack, was there anything else that happened that might give us some clues about, what he was thinking or planning?
Well, Tagesschau reported that Talib A actually missed a court date the day before the attack.
He missed a court date. What for?
We don't know the details of that court appearance yet, but missing it, especially right before this happened, it definitely raises questions. Like, was there a chance to stop this,
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned earlier about online radicalization. Is there any proof that he was, like, active in those kinds of online communities?
Deutsche Welle, They pointed out some pretty disturbing social media posts, supposedly from him. He was apparently threatening to kill Germans, and he thought the government was, like, trying to force Islam on everyone.
Wow, that's scary stuff. What platforms was he on? Were they like trying to, control what he was posting?
The reports don't say exactly which platforms,
Yeah.
but it really points to this bigger issue, right? The role social media plays in spreading these extreme ideas, especially now with some platforms, not doing much to moderate content.
It's terrifying to think about, these platforms giving people a voice, but then they use it for hate. Did the German authorities have any idea he was planning to do this?
It's too early to say for sure. The investigation's still going on, and we'll probably learn more in the next few weeks, maybe months. But, the fact that he was on leave, he had a history of making threats, he skipped a court date, and then all this stuff he was saying online.
Yeah, that's a lot of red flags.
Yeah, it definitely paints a picture of someone who was on a dangerous path.
Hmm.
And it's definitely something they're going to be looking into very carefully.
It sounds like we're dealing with someone really complex, someone whose actions are hard to understand. This whole case, it shows how extremism is changing and how hard it is to stop it. What do you think? How will this affect security at future events, especially given that, like we talked about, that need to balance safety with keeping these spaces open and accessible?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, you don't want to overreact and create this, like, fortress around these events. That defeats the whole purpose.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can't just pretend this doesn't happen, right?
It's like, how do you prevent something like this without turning everything into, a security checkpoint?
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest lessons here is that we need to get better at understanding how people become radicalized. We can't just rely on those old ways of profiling, looking at demographics or what groups people belong to. Like Tala A, he really shows us that we need to look at individual experiences. What are their specific grievances? What ideologies are they drawn to? And like we talked about, what are they seeing online?
Makes sense. So, beyond the security stuff, how do you think this whole attack will affect like the conversation about online extremism and, what these social media platforms are doing about it?
Oh, it's definitely going to heat up the debate about, what responsibility these companies have to control the content on their platforms. I mean, Bay was using social media to spread hate, maybe even connect with other extremists. That's a huge concern.
Do you think more regulation is the answer, though? I mean, wouldn't that bring up issues about censorship and free speech?
It's tricky, right? I mean, if you make the regulations too broad, you could end up stifling legitimate conversation. But we can't just ignore the fact that these platforms can be used to spread hate and incite violence. Maybe a better way is to focus on transparency. Make sure these companies are working with law enforcement, and also they need to develop better tools to moderate content effectively.
Yeah, it sounds like finding that balance is going to be really difficult. Are there like other solutions besides regulation that might be worth trying?
Definitely. Education and media literacy are huge. We need to help people become more critical of what they see online. Teach them how to spot disinformation and propaganda, and help them understand how these algorithms work, how they shape what we see.
Right, because those algorithms, they can be sneaky. All right, so shifting gears a bit, I'm thinking about the victims and their families. Like, what kind of support do they get after something like this?
Well, the immediate response is usually, medical care, counseling, and any kind of practical help they need. The German government, they actually have programs to provide financial compensation and long-term support for victims of terrorism.
Okay, that's good to hear. But what about, like, the community itself? How has Magdeburg been dealing with all this?
From what I've seen, it seems like they've really come together to support each other. Vigils, memorial services, people raising money for the victims. That kind of shared grief and solidarity can be really powerful. Helps people heal after something like this.
It's amazing how people come together in times of tragedy. Do you think this attack will, like, have a long-term impact on Magdeburg?
It's hard to say for sure, but yeah, I think it's probably going to stay with them.
Right.
It might lead to stricter security at public events, but hopefully it'll also bring people closer and make them even more determined to fight extremism in all its forms.
Yeah, hopefully. I'm also curious about the bigger picture. Do you think this will have any impact on Germany's political landscape, especially with the far right gaining ground lately?
It's possible that far-right groups will try to use this to push their agenda, especially since Talibé apparently had some sympathy for the AfD party. But we have to remember, he was also saying he was against Islam.
Hmm.
So his beliefs were all over the place. He's not easily categorized.
It's a good reminder that extremism can come from anywhere, really, and we need to be vigilant against all of it, no matter what political side it's coming from. What about the investigation itself? Where do things stand now?
Well, it's still pretty early, but investigators are working hard to figure out why he did this, what he was doing online, and whether there were any missed opportunities to stop him. They're probably looking through his computer, phone, social media accounts, bank records, all that stuff. Plus, they'll be talking to his family, friends, colleagues, anyone who might have some insight into what was going on.
Sounds like a lot of ground to cover. Do you have any thoughts on what the prosecutors will focus on when they, build their case against him?
Well, based on what we know so far, I think they're going to try to prove that he planned this, that it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing. They'll probably point to the threats he made online, his previous conviction for making threats, and the fact that he intentionally drove into that crowded market. Plus, they'll be digging into any connections he might have had with extremist groups, online or in person.
So basically, they're trying to piece together the whole puzzle, right? But even with all that, there's still that big question. Could this have been prevented?
It's the question everyone asks after something like this happens. And like we discussed, there were warnings. But it's easy to say that now, looking back. The challenge is to see those warnings in real time and do something about them without, taking away people's freedoms or making everyone paranoid.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough balance, and it's something we're going to keep struggling with as we try to deal with this new kind of extremism.
What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this whole discussion?
I think the big thing here is we got to be vigilant, not just as a society, but as individuals too.
What do you mean by, being vigilant in ourselves?
Well, it's about, really paying attention to our own biases. Are we buying into any of these extremist ideas? And, thinking about what we do online, how that affects our worldview. It's on all of us to push back against hate speech, to have real conversations and to, be open to different perspectives.
Yeah, that makes sense. We can't just blame everyone else. We got to look at ourselves, too. It's also, thinking about the mental health aspect of this whole thing. Televe, he was a psychiatrist, right? But he was obviously struggling, too. Do you think there's a connection between mental health and, becoming an extremist? It's important to remember that we can't just make blanket statements, or, stigmatize people with mental illness. But, yeah, some research suggests that certain conditions, like if someone's really paranoid or their sense of reality is distorted, that could make them more vulnerable to these extremist ideas.
So it's not like a direct cause and effect, but mental health could be a factor sometimes. What does that mean for, trying to prevent stuff like this?
Well, it means we need to look at the whole picture, both the ideology and the psychology behind extremism. That means investing in mental health resources, early intervention programs, and creating support systems for people who might be at risk.
So it's more than just security, right? We have to address the underlying causes. Do you think law enforcement has a role to play in all this?
Oh, absolutely. They're key for investigating and stopping these extremist networks. But they shouldn't just be reacting after something bad happens. They can be proactive too, reaching out to communities, building trust, especially with groups that are vulnerable, and working with social services to identify people who might be heading down that path.
It seems like we need everyone involved, a real team effort. Any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap this up?
I think, even when things seem really dark, it's important to remember that there's always hope. We can learn from these tragedies. We can change our approach and work together to make the world a safer place for everyone.
That's a great point to end on. To our listeners, keep learning about this issue, keep having these important conversations, and, stay vigilant against all forms of extremism. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoy our daily news podcast and want to stay updated, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications. Your support really helps us bring you the latest news every day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.